Ryan sat on the couch, absently flipping through a magazine. It was a typical evening, quiet, peaceful. Julia was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. But there was something in her demeanor that felt off. She was speaking in hushed tones on the phone, her eyes darting around the room like she was hiding something. Every so often, she would glance nervously toward him. When she hung up, Ryan's brow furrowed. "Everything all right?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, just work stuff." "You know how it is," Julia replied, not meeting his eyes. She quickly changed the subject, asking him about his day. But her body language spoke volumes. Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It had been days since that first strange evening. But Ryan's unease had only grown. He couldn't get the image of Julia whispering on the phone out of his mind. The small, inexplicable things were starting to add up. Her late-night outings, her distracted manner, the vague excuses. Something in him told him she was hiding something. That evening, when Julia said she was meeting a friend at the usual cafe, Ryan didn't buy it. He told her he had to run a quick errand. As soon as she left, he grabbed his coat and followed, her at a distance. His heart pounded with each step, but he told himself he was being paranoid. Still, something told him he needed to know for sure. The streets blurred around him as he trailed her, his pulse quickening when she turned toward an upscale hotel, one he knew wasn't near any cafes. "Where the hell is she going?" Ryan whispered to himself, his breath catching in his throat. Ryan kept a safe distance, watching as Julia walked up to the hotel's front desk. His feet were planted firmly on the ground, but his mind was already running through a dozen scenarios. She was speaking to the receptionist, her voice low and familiar. But then she said something that stopped him in his tracks. "Hi, I'm Lauren Davis. I have a reservation." Ryan's chest tightened. Lauren Davis? A fake name. Why would Julia need one? The shock hit him like a wave, and he staggered slightly, his head spinning. The woman he'd trusted for 10 years had been hiding something this dark. He wanted to run to her, confront her, demand answers right there, but the knot in his stomach kept him rooted to the spot. Lauren Davis, who was she? And why was Julia pretending to be someone else? Ryan's fists clenched as he stared at Julia, now moving toward the elevator with a cool, composed expression. His mind raced through every memory of their life together, the shared laughter, the intimate conversations, the quiet moments that made him feel like they were inseparable. But now, with the name Lauren Davis echoing in his mind, every single moment felt like a lie. His trust had been shattered, and with it, everything he thought he knew about their relationship. His chest constricted as the weight of betrayal settled in. Is this a business meeting? He tried to reason with himself, but the gnawing doubt refused to let him go. The uncertainty gripped him tighter. Is this an affair? The pain of that thought was too much to bear. His breath grew shallow, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. This wasn't just a misplaced trust. This was something far deeper. Ryan stood frozen, watching as Julia disappeared into the elevator. His mind was consumed with rage and heartbreak, but something in him, something deep down, held him back from rushing in to confront her. It wasn't just his wife that he was confronting. It was his entire life. If he confronted her now, she'd twist the truth, make excuses, tell him it was nothing. She was good at that. No, he couldn't give her the chance to manipulate the situation. He needed to know the truth, every last detail, before he made his next move. So he made the decision, one that would haunt him for days to come. He would wait. He would follow her further. Julia was gone now, but Ryan remained rooted to the spot. His eyes traced the elevator doors, feeling an overwhelming sense of helplessness. This moment, this discovery, marked the beginning of something dark, something obsessive. He couldn't walk away. His world had just been turned upside down, and he couldn't let it go until he knew exactly what was going on. Whatever secret Julia was keeping, Ryan was going to uncover it. He had to. The thought consumed him, like a fire that wouldn't die down. With each step away from the hotel, his mind spun with questions, his heart burning with the need for answers. His thoughts became darker, more obsessive. His life had been a lie, and now he would uncover every single hidden truth, no matter the cost. Ryan and Julia's love story had always seemed like one destined to last forever. They met in their 20s, instantly drawn to each other's energy, their conversations flowing effortlessly. He was a rising star in his career, and she, the supportive wife who stood by him at every event, every milestone. They married young, filled with dreams of a future they'd build together. Vacations, home renovations, family dinners. Their bond was forged in shared laughter and tender moments, and for a time it felt unbreakable. But over the years, the cracks that began to form were subtle at first. A missed anniversary here, a late night at work there. Small things. Nothing that would shake the foundation of their marriage, or so they thought. Ryan's career had always demanded much of his time, but he justified it with promises of a better future for both of them. He worked long hours, traveled for weeks at a time, always with the hope that each sacrifice would be worth it. The late nights became routine, the missed dinners frequent. Julia tried to understand, often telling herself that this was just the price of success. But over time, it became clear that her role in the relationship was slipping into the background. Ryan's face became a blur in her daily life, his attention elsewhere. "I'll be home for dinner tomorrow, I promise," Ryan would say as he dashed out the door, his words heavy with good intentions but empty in their delivery. Julia, standing at the door, would offer a weak smile. She didn't say anything, but her heart ached. She didn't feel like his partner anymore. She felt like an afterthought. At night, when the house was silent and the weight of their estrangement pressed in on her, Julia felt like a shadow in her own life. She would walk around their home, tracing the familiar objects, the photos on the wall, the empty chair beside her. But none of it felt real. She had become invisible to Ryan, and in that invisibility, a deep loneliness began to take root. She longed for affection, for the passion that once fueled their relationship. Her heart ached for the attention that now seemed reserved for his career, his colleagues, everyone but her. She could hear Ryan's footsteps as he paced through their home, at odd hours, but he never noticed her. Never stopped long enough to ask how she was feeling. It wasn't the absence of physical presence that hurt the most. It was the emotional void that had crept in. The longing grew, and in her isolation, Julia found herself searching for something, anything, to feel alive again, to feel seen. Ryan's suspicions didn't appear all at once. It started small. An unnoticed glance at Julia's phone screen when she thought he wasn't looking. The faint smile she gave at an unreadable text. The way she would lock her phone immediately when he entered the room, a twinge of guilt in her eyes. "What's going on, Julia?" Ryan asked one evening, trying to break through the growing silence between them. She turned to him, her lips curling into a smile that felt too rehearsed. "Nothing, just work stuff," she said, her voice light, but her eyes avoided his. Ryan didn't press her, but the words stayed with him. Work stuff. It was always work stuff. He wanted to believe her. He needed to. But a knot began to tighten in his chest. As the weeks passed, Julia's behavior grew more erratic. She would disappear late at night, returning hours later with a distant look in her eyes. When Ryan asked, she offered vague explanations, had a late meeting, or caught up with an old friend, but it was more than that. It was the way she was constantly on her phone, her body language defensive, the way she would always change the subject when Ryan tried to ask deeper questions. There was an unfamiliar perfume on her clothes when she returned, a scent that didn't belong to her. Ryan noticed everything. He just didn't know what to do with it. He wanted to confront her, to demand the truth, but there was always that voice in his head, whispering, maybe it's nothing. But deep down, he knew. It wasn't nothing. The tension in the house was palpable, thick with unsaid words. Ryan found himself spiraling, unable to sleep, unable to focus on anything but the gnawing sense that something was terribly wrong. But each time the truth seemed within reach, he would push it aside. It's just work stress. It's just a phase, he told himself. But the cracks in their relationship were widening, and every time he looked at Julia, the distance between them seemed more insurmountable. His thoughts were clouded with doubt. Was he overreacting? Was he imagining things? It didn't help that Julia seemed more distant, more caught up in her own world. Every interaction felt like a fleeting moment, a brief touch of her hand, a strained conversation. Ryan's heart ached with uncertainty. He wanted to believe she wasn't hiding anything. He wanted to trust her. But with every passing day, the fear grew. Julia had convinced herself that she deserved this. The affair wasn't just about the physical connection. It was about the escape. In the arms of someone else, she felt seen again, desired. She no longer felt invisible. Her meetings with Damien weren't just about satisfying a need for affection. They were about reclaiming a piece of herself that had been lost in the shadows of her marriage. Every stolen moment with him felt like a burst of life, a dangerous thrill that she couldn't resist. I deserve this, she whispered to herself, as though trying to justify the chaos she was creating. But the truth gnawed at her. I'm living a lie. She would tell herself it was temporary, that it didn't mean anything, but deep down she knew that the more she gave into the affair, the further she fell from the life she had once loved. Ryan had never been the type to question his wife without cause. They had always shared an unspoken trust, built over years of partnership. But lately that trust had begun to fray at the edges. Small signs. Julia was withdrawing from him, becoming distant, distracted. She would linger over her phone, her fingers scrolling quickly, her eyes darting away when he entered the room. There were moments when he thought he saw something in her gaze, a flicker of guilt that she tried to mask with a smile. Julia, is everything okay? Ryan asked one evening, his voice tinged with uncertainty. She looked at him, offering a smile too quick, too perfect. Everything's fine, Ryan, just tired, that's all. But there was something in her tone, a note of defensiveness that didn't sit right with him. Ryan had always prided himself on his instincts, and right now they were screaming at him. Something was wrong. He just couldn't put his finger on it. Ryan couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling any longer. Every time Julia left the house, he felt the weight of suspicion press down on him. His mind raced with questions, but each time he confronted her, she deflected, expertly covering her tracks. That's when he made the decision. He needed answers. He hired a private investigator, a man named Thomas, who specialized in uncovering the truth in situations like this. The investigator's task was simple: follow Julia. Find out where she was going, who she was meeting. Ryan gave him the details, the times Julia would leave, the vague excuses she used. I just want to know the truth, Thomas. Whatever it is, I need to face it, Ryan had told him, his voice strained with a mix of resolve and fear. Thomas nodded, understanding the gravity of what Ryan was asking. I'll be discreet, Mr. Carter. We'll get to the bottom of this. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. Ryan could hardly focus on work, his thoughts constantly drifting to Julia. The investigator's report came in a week later. It was like a punch to the gut. Julia had been meeting a man named Damian Ross. The meetings were frequent, the locations always discreet. Hotels, dark corners of restaurants, places where no one would recognize them. Ryan's heart pounded as he read through the details. The worst part wasn't the meetings, it was the fake name Julia had been using. Lauren Davis. Ryan felt like the ground beneath him was slipping. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal, a deliberate choice. He wanted to throw the paper across the room, to scream, but he couldn't. The realization of what was happening hit him harder than any confrontation could. He was watching his life unravel piece by piece, and he couldn't stop it. The knowledge festered inside Ryan like a poison. He couldn't escape the thoughts of Julia with Damian. His mind spiraled, becoming consumed with what he had learned. He began to watch her more closely, studying her every move. When Julia left, the house Ryan would follow, not physically but in his mind. He replayed every interaction, every word she had said, searching for signs, for cracks in her facade. Was there guilt in her eyes? Was she hiding something? The trust they had once shared seemed like a distant memory, and with every passing day Ryan's paranoia deepened. The small things began to look like clues, the innocent gestures now heavy with suspicion. "I'm just tired, Ryan," Julia would say when she came home late. But Ryan was no longer convinced. His heart was full of doubt, and his mind was trapped in a web of confusion. He stopped being the man who loved her. Instead, he became a man obsessed with uncovering the truth, and in his obsession he withdrew. Conversations grew shorter. The warmth between them vanished. Julia didn't notice. Not yet. But Ryan could feel it, a gulf widening between them. Filled with distrust and silent accusations, the facade of their life together remained intact, at least on the outside. Ryan went to work, smiled at social gatherings, and pretended nothing was amiss. But inside, he was falling apart. At home, he kept his distance. When Julia talked, he nodded, his thoughts miles away. He went through the motions, but the connection was gone. Julia was too caught up in her own world to notice. Ryan felt like an actor in a play, pretending to live a life he no longer recognized. He kept the anger and hurt buried deep inside, unable to release it. The weight of it crushed him every day, and yet he wore his mask, his perfect husband mask, for the world to see. But behind closed doors his mind raced. Every time Julia left, he wondered, where was she really going? Who was she really seeing? And every time she came home, he searched her face for clues, proof that she was betraying him. The truth was clear now. Julia was having an affair. The end. Evidence was right in front of him, undeniable. But Ryan couldn't bring himself to confront her just yet. Something in him still wanted more answers, wanted to understand why. Should he confront her, risk everything, and finally get the truth? Or should he dig deeper, uncovering even more of her secrets before he made a move? The question gnawed at him. Guilt twisted in his stomach. He didn't want to hurt her, not really, but the betrayal stung, leaving a wound that wouldn't heal. He loved her, and yet, the thought of her with another man consumed him. He spent sleepless nights torn between what was right and what was just. Would confronting her be the right thing to do, or was it his anger clouding his judgment? The longer he waited, the more the guilt built inside him, as if his own actions, his decision to spy, were no different from her betrayal. As the affair continued, The cracks in Julia's marriage deepened. The emotional isolation she felt was something she had never fully acknowledged, but now it seemed to define her every waking moment. She had been patient, understanding, supportive. She had given Ryan everything, her love, her loyalty, her life. But what had it gotten her? Loneliness. A marriage that felt more like a prison than a partnership. With Damien, it was different. With him, she wasn't just a wife, a mother, an afterthought. She was desired. She was needed. He saw her in a way that Ryan no longer did. Every touch from Damien, every whispered word felt like the validation she had been starving for. But guilt followed her like a shadow. She wasn't a bad person, was she? She had tried so hard to make her marriage work. But it had all been in vain. She couldn't ignore the emptiness any longer, and Damien filled it in ways Ryan never could. Damien was no knight in shining armor. He was a master manipulator, a predator who preyed on Julia's vulnerability. He knew exactly what to say, when to say it. He understood her insecurities better than she did herself. "Ryan doesn't deserve you," he'd whisper, his hands brushing against her skin, sending sparks of excitement through her. "You've been giving him everything, and look where it's gotten you. He's left you in the dark, Julia. I'll never do that to you." Each word planted seeds of doubt. Each touch made her feel more alive, more needed. Damien's control over her grew, subtle at first but now undeniable. He didn't just love her, he owned her. And Julia, lost in the passion he offered, didn't know how to escape. She was drowning in the emotional maze he had constructed for her, each lie, each secret, feeding into the trap. The guilt weighed heavily on Julia, a constant presence at the back of her mind. Every time she saw Ryan, she felt it, this suffocating mixture of love and betrayal. But with Damien, it was different. She felt alive with him, wanted, desirable, in ways she hadn't in years. She was torn. Each moment with Damien made her feel guilty, but she couldn't walk away from the passion, the connection they shared. The affair was a twisted, tangled mess, a knot that she couldn't untangle no matter how hard she tried. She wanted to feel whole again, and Damien was the only one who could make her feel that way. But deep down, she knew she was destroying her marriage, and a small voice inside her screamed for her to stop. But she couldn't. The walls between Ryan and Julia grew thicker with each passing day. Their interactions became nothing more than empty exchanges, each one more painful than the last. Neither of them spoke the truth. Neither of them acknowledged the elephant in the room. Ryan's world was crumbling around him, and Julia's life was no better. She felt the emotional distance between them like a chasm that could never be bridged. And even though she knew the affair was wrong, she couldn't bring herself to end it. The consequences of betrayal had already begun to unfold, and neither Ryan nor Julia knew how far this would go. Neither knew the depth of the storm they had created. Ryan sat in his car, gripping the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The evidence had been laid out before him, undeniable, yet he hadn't been able to accept it until now. Every lie, every suspicious glance, every late night. It had all led him here. He had tried to ignore it, convince himself it was nothing, but the truth had already planted its seed deep within him. He watched Julia's car pull into the familiar hotel parking lot, the one she had visited countless times, a place he had once driven by without a second thought. Ryan's heart raced, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and disbelief. He hadn't planned for this moment, hadn't known if he was truly ready, but something inside him told him it was now or never. "Tonight I'm getting the truth," Ryan muttered under his breath, slamming the car door as he followed her, keeping a careful distance. His mind churned with questions, with doubts. But one thing was clear. This time, he wasn't walking away without answers. Ryan parked a few spaces away and waited, his breath coming in shallow bursts. Every second felt like an eternity. His eyes tracked Julia's every movement as she entered the hotel lobby. He wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe he thought she would sense him following. Maybe he thought she'd confront him, but instead she walked in like everything was fine, like she wasn't meeting a man behind his back. His rage bubbled to the surface as he stood, storming, through the hotel's entrance. He didn't think, didn't stop to question his actions. All he could think was this was it. He followed her up to the door and waited, just long enough for her to be inside. And then, he pushed the door open. "Julia!" Ryan's voice cracked, his fury surging through him. The sight that greeted him burned into his memory. Julia, in the arms of another man. Damian Ross. The air thickened with tension. Ryan's body tensed, his fists clenching at his sides. His voice, barely a whisper, tore through the silence. "Is this what you wanted? To betray me like this?" Julia's eyes went wide, a mix of guilt and shock flashing across her face. She tried to speak, but no words came. Damian, however, didn't flinch. Damian straightened up, exhaling slowly. He was unfazed by Ryan's presence, almost as if he had been waiting for this moment. He crossed his arms, a smug smile curling on his lips as he sized up Ryan. "Did you think she'd be faithful to a man like you?" Damian sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're so blind, Ryan. You didn't even notice what she was missing, did you?" Ryan's blood boiled, but he couldn't look away. From Damian, the man who had slowly stolen everything from him. "You think you're better than me?" Ryan shot back, his voice breaking with a mix of rage and hurt. "You think she needs you to feel alive? You're just a parasite." Damian smirked, stepping forward, and Ryan's fists clenched tighter. "You were never enough for her," Damian said coolly. "Maybe if you paid attention to her needs instead of your own ego, you'd have kept her." Ryan's vision blurred, his anger overtaking his sense of reason. Damian's taunting words made it all worse, the humiliation consuming him. He wanted to tear this man apart, make him feel the same pain that was ripping through him. Ryan exploded, his voice hoarse with fury. "You've been lying to me, Julia. All this time you've been lying to me." Julia opened her mouth to speak, but Ryan wouldn't let her. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me? With him?" His chest heaved with every breath, each word a dagger. "I didn't mean to hurt you," Julia said softly, but her voice barely made it past the noise in Ryan's head. "You didn't mean to hurt me?" Ryan laughed bitterly, his hands shaking with rage. "And what about me, huh? What about my pain? You've been seeing him behind my back lying to me, and I had to follow you here to get the truth?" He was barely holding it together. Every accusation, every word of betrayal hit harder than the last. "I never wanted this to happen," Julia said, but Ryan couldn't listen. Her words were just noise now, meaningless. His eyes burned with fury as he stared at her, his voice raw. "You don't get to explain this, not now, not after everything you've done." The air in the room grew heavier, suffocating, and Ryan's emotions boiled over in an explosion of rage. He couldn't stop it, couldn't hold it in anymore. His marriage was shattered beyond repair. Without warning, Ryan lunged at Damian, his body fueled by raw, unfiltered anger. His fist connected with Damian's jaw, the force of the punch throwing Damian backward, but he didn't stay down. The two men clashed in a violent frenzy, shouting insults, throwing punches. Ryan's vision was blurred with fury, each blow landing, with more force than the last. Julia screamed, trying to pull them apart, her hands frantic, her voice filled with panic. "Stop! Both of you, stop!" she cried. But neither man listened. Damien shoved Ryan off, his fist connecting with Ryan's stomach, knocking the wind out of him. Ryan stumbled back, but immediately charged again, his fury blinding him. He didn't care about the consequences, didn't care who saw them. All that mattered was the destruction of everything he had once believed in. The fight raged on, the violence escalating until they were both bloodied and bruised. Julia stood helpless, tears streaming down her face, unable to stop the chaos that had engulfed her life. The hotel's security team rushed in, loud voices echoing in the hallway. They grabbed Ryan, pulling him away from Damien, his body still shaking with rage. "Let go of me!" Ryan yelled, but the security guards held him, firm, dragging him out of the room. Julia watched as her husband was escorted out, her heart pounding in her chest. The world felt like it was slipping away from her, and she had no idea how to stop it. Damien, now standing alone in the room, wiped his mouth, a satisfied smirk on his face. He looked over at Julia, but there was no empathy in his gaze. Just the cold satisfaction of having won. Ryan sat in his car, the engine running, but his mind was far from the road ahead. His heart felt like it was torn in two. What had he done? He had confronted Julia, yes, but at what cost? His chest ached as he replayed the fight over and over again in his mind, the words, the violence, the helplessness. He had lost control, and in doing so, had lost her. He felt like a shell of the man he once was, consumed by anger and regret. What had happened to the love they once shared? What had happened to their marriage? It was gone, shattered in a few short moments, and there was no way to fix it. His thoughts spiraled, the suffocating weight of betrayal pressing down on him. He felt hollow, broken, and utterly lost. Julia sat in the hotel room, her body numb, the silence surrounding her like a prison. She had done this. She had destroyed everything. Her affair with Damien, everything they had built, was laid bare for the world to see. She had never imagined it would come to this, but it had, and now there was no going back. Her heart raced as the reality of her actions hit her. Ryan was gone. The trust they once had was gone. She had humiliated him, destroyed their marriage, and all for what? The guilt ate at her, gnawing at her insides. She couldn't look at herself in the mirror. She had betrayed the only man who had ever loved her, and there was no one left to blame but herself. Ryan and Julia's lives were shattered. Their marriage, once built on love and trust, was now in ruins. The confrontation at the hotel had left irreversible damage, and both were forced to confront the reality of their actions. Ryan drove aimlessly, unsure of where to go, unsure of what to do. His mind was clouded, his emotions a mixture of anger, heartbreak, and regret. His world had been ripped apart, and there was no way to put it back together. Julia sat in the hotel room, facing the aftermath of her choices. The affair, once a secret she could hide, had become her public humiliation. She had destroyed her marriage, and now she was alone. Neither knew where they went from here. The bonds they had once shared were irreparably shattered, and both had been forever changed by the consequences of their actions. The aftermath of the confrontation had left the walls of Ryan and Julia's marriage crumbling like dust. In the cold silence of their once shared home, Ryan sat at the kitchen table, his eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. His fingers clutched the divorce papers with an intensity that mirrored the storm raging in his chest. He couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't stay with a woman who had betrayed him so completely. Julia, sitting across from him, felt the weight of his gaze, the quiet judgment that seemed to pierce her very soul. She had known this day was coming, but that didn't make the sting any less painful. The love they had once shared felt like a distant memory, swallowed by the darkness of her choices. "Ryan, please," Julia whispered, her voice trembling. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Ryan looked up at her, his expression hollow. "It doesn't matter anymore, Julia. You did it. You chose him." Her heart shattered further at the coldness in his voice. There was no forgiveness, no second chance. This was the end. Ryan signed the papers without another word, his hand shaking as he pushed them toward her. Julia stared at the contract, her fingers hovering over the lines as if signing it would sever something deep inside her, something that was already lost. Days bled into weeks, and Ryan withdrew into himself, each passing hour a torment he couldn't escape. He stopped returning calls, ignored texts, and shut the door on everyone who had once been his support. Friends tried to reach out, but he wasn't interested. How could he face them, knowing they all knew what Julia had done? His world had become a prison, and the walls felt like they were closing in. The house felt empty, even though it was filled with things that used to matter. Photos of their wedding day, souvenirs from trips they'd taken together, the love letters they'd once exchanged. Each item now felt like a cruel reminder of a life he no longer recognized. Ryan spent his nights staring at the ceiling, consumed by grief and regret. He replayed the last months over and over in his head. Could he have done something differently? Should he have noticed the signs sooner? His self-blame ate away at him, gnawing at his very core. Every part of him longed for the peace he couldn't find, for the answers that would never come. Was he weak? Or was this simply his fate, to be the fool left behind by the woman he had loved? The town buzzed with gossip, its whispers spreading like wildfire. Julia could no longer step into the grocery store or walk down the street without hearing the muttered accusations, the harsh judgment, and the pointed stares. Friends who had once stood by her side now crossed the street to avoid her. She had become the pariah of their small community, the woman who had destroyed her marriage for a fleeting affair. Every corner she turned, she faced the cold silence of those who once cared for her. She had no one. Julia sat in the small cafe, the chair across from her empty. She couldn't help but wonder if this was her new life. Isolated, despised, a woman with no place to belong. She had once been someone who was loved, respected, but now she was a ghost. Her mind wandered to Damien, the man who had once promised her excitement, adventure, and freedom. Where was he now? Why hadn't he stood by her in the aftermath of their secret? Julia's stomach churned with the realization that she had traded her marriage, her stability, for nothing more than a fleeting escape. Now, she had nothing but her own shame. As the weeks passed, Damien's presence in Julia's life began to fade. He didn't call, he didn't show up. He was gone. The man who had seduced her with promises of passion and excitement had disappeared into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a trail of destruction. Julia's calls went unanswered. Her messages, once met with eager responses, now fell into an empty abyss. Damien had left her to deal with the mess he had helped create. He had slunk away, leaving her to face the consequences of their affair on her own. The emotional burden now fell squarely on her shoulders. She had to live with the knowledge that her life had been dismantled by her own choices, and the man who had been her lover was nowhere to be found. Julia sat in her car, the weight of the realization sinking in. Damien was gone, and she had nothing left but the wreckage of her own decisions. The divorce proceedings were long, drawn out, and painful. Every detail of Julia's infidelity was exposed, the intimate betrayals laid bare for the entire community to see. Ryan's lawyer painted a picture of a broken man, his wife's infidelity a betrayal that had ruined his life. Julia, on the other hand, sat in the courtroom, her face flushed with shame. Her lawyer, once sympathetic, now seemed to treat her like an afterthought, a woman who had fallen from grace. She had never imagined it would be like this. Every word, every argument, reminding her of the choices she had made and the destruction they had caused. The town watched, their whispers, louder than ever. Ryan, once seen as the strong, reliable man, was now the broken husband, left behind by the woman who had betrayed him. His reputation, once solid, was now tainted by her affair. Julia, meanwhile, was labeled as the villain, the woman who had caused her own ruin. Every step of the legal process felt like a public execution. She couldn't escape the stares, the harsh words, the pity. The weight of the world pressed down on her as she sat in the courtroom, feeling smaller and smaller with each passing minute. Alone in his apartment, Ryan sat in the dark, his fingers tracing the edges of the divorce papers once more. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. His mind, however, was anything but still. Had he done the right thing? He had filed for divorce, yes. He had walked away from the marriage that had once meant everything to him. But now, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been too hasty, if there was something he could have done differently to save it. Was there a way to fix this? He asked aloud, his voice barely a whisper. Could we have worked through it? Ryan stared at the photo of them from their wedding day, a memory of a time when everything felt right. He felt a hollow ache in his chest as he thought about the life they had built together. What had gone wrong? Was it just fate? Or was it something he had missed, something he should have seen? The uncertainty gnawed at him, pulling him deeper, into despair. Julia stood in front of her bathroom mirror, her reflection staring back at her like a stranger. Her once bright eyes were dull, her face pale and drawn. She had been hiding from the truth for so long, but now she had to face it. She had chosen Damien. She had destroyed her marriage with Ryan, not because she wanted excitement or adventure, but because she had been running from something inside herself, a fear, a dissatisfaction she didn't understand. But now, standing alone in the bathroom, the reality of her actions crashed over her like a tidal wave. Damien had been a mirage, a temporary escape that had only deepened her misery. He hadn't loved her. He had never intended to stay. He had used her as much as she had used him. Julia's heart ached with the weight of her regrets. She had destroyed everything that had once mattered. Now, as the loneliness wrapped itself around her like a shroud, she wondered if she would ever be able to rebuild her life, if she would ever be able to forgive herself. There were no easy answers, only the heavy truth of her own actions, and the consequences she would have to live with for the rest of her life. Ryan sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the empty spaces where memories once lived. The house felt like a shell, a ghost of what it used to be. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one tugging him in different directions. He had always believed in the sanctity of marriage, the bond that should never be broken, but now that belief felt like a lie. Julia had shattered that world, and in doing so she had shattered him too. He had filed for divorce, but it hadn't brought any relief. It only deepened the ache, the gaping hole where love used to reside. His fingers trembled as he reached for his phone, but he didn't know who to call. His friends? They had distanced themselves, unsure of what to say. His family? They had no answers either. Across town, Julia was lying in her bed, the weight of her choices crushing her with every breath. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't anticipated the pain of watching everything she'd built crumble to dust. The affair, the lies, the escape. It had all seemed so thrilling at the time. But now it felt like poison in her veins. She had lost Ryan. She had lost herself. And the worst part was that she couldn't even blame him for leaving. He had every right to walk away. But the guilt, the suffocating guilt, kept her awake at night. She couldn't undo what she had done. She couldn't take back the pieces of her soul she had given away in the arms of another man. For weeks, Ryan wandered through his days in a fog. His mind replayed the moment when Julia had confessed, her tear-filled eyes, her quivering voice. She had apologized, begged him for forgiveness, but the damage had already been done. Could he have prevented it? Was he too blind to see the cracks in their marriage? Ryan couldn't escape the haunting thought that he had failed her in some way. He had been distant, yes, preoccupied with work, but was that really enough to justify her betrayal? He couldn't reconcile the love they once had with the reality of the woman who had shattered it. In quiet moments, the bitterness bubbled up, and he would catch himself staring at their wedding photo, as if searching for some clue to explain how things had gone so wrong. He had once vowed to protect her, but now he felt nothing but a deep, unyielding sadness. Meanwhile, Julia's guilt festered inside her, gnawing away at her sanity. She couldn't look at herself in the mirror without feeling disgust. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Damien's face, heard his voice, felt the heat of his touch. She had convinced herself that she needed him, that her marriage was suffocating her. But now, those lies rang hollow in her mind. She had destroyed everything. She had burned her bridges with Ryan and had left herself exposed. She couldn't go back to the woman she had been. She couldn't return to a life that no longer made sense. There was no tidy conclusion to their story, no moment where everything clicked into place, where Ryan and Julia could look back and say they understood what had happened. Instead, they were both left with the aftermath of their actions. Two broken people, each struggling to survive in the ruins of their past. Ryan's grief did not fade, and Julia's guilt did not dissipate. The wounds of betrayal were deep and wide, and no amount of time could heal them. They were left to face the harsh truth that some things cannot be fixed, no matter how much time or effort is spent trying to repair them. In the quiet hours of the night, Ryan's thoughts drifted back to the question that had plagued him since the affair was uncovered. Why did it happen? He had never been a perfect husband. His work had often consumed him, leaving little room for the emotional intimacy Julia had craved. But was that enough to push her into another man's arms? His insecurities gnawed at him. He had always felt like he wasn't enough for her, too predictable, too reliable, too safe. Could that have driven her to seek something more dangerous, more thrilling? In the wake of her betrayal, he questioned whether he had failed to be the man she needed. He wondered if he had been too absorbed in his own life to notice the cracks forming in their marriage. Julia, on the other hand, had sought validation from Damien in a way she had never sought from Ryan. She had always felt like something was missing, like there was an emptiness in her soul that couldn't be filled by the predictable, stable life she had with him. Damien had given her that thrill, that escape. She had convinced herself that she deserved more, that she needed something different. But now, staring into the abyss of her own choices, she realized how foolish she had been. Damien had been a distraction, a temporary fix to a much deeper problem. The emptiness she felt inside had nothing to do with Ryan. It had everything to do with her own fears, her own insecurities, and her own inability to face the truth about herself. The consequences of infidelity were never as simple as they seemed. Ryan had thought he would be able to move on, that he would find a way to rebuild his life, but the emotional scars ran deeper than he had realized. He was no longer the same person he had been before the betrayal. The trust he had once given so freely was gone, replaced by suspicion and pain. And in its place, there was a cold, empty space that no amount of time or effort could fill. Julia, too, had been irrevocably changed. The affair had cost her everything: her dignity, her reputation, and her sense of self-worth. The shame she felt now was unbearable, and the loneliness that had once driven her into another man's arms now felt suffocating. She had pushed away the very person who had loved her, and now she was paying the price. Neither of them could escape the consequences of what had transpired. They had both been damaged beyond repair, and the scars they carried would shape their futures in ways they could never have predicted. The story didn't offer closure, no, neat answers or resolutions. It simply showed the harsh reality of betrayal and the way it changed everything. Ryan and Julia had both learned the hard way that some choices cannot be undone. The past, with all its mistakes and regrets, would always be a part of them,